I was only 14 when my parents threw me out, claiming I was too weak to work. Now, years later, I'm living in the house I inherited from my uncle, and they're desperately trying to reconnect with me. Back then, I felt like the unluckiest 14-year-old alive. I lived in a rural farming town in Missouri, where almost every family relied on agriculture. Here, children were expected to work on farms as soon as they were strong enough, and only a handful of parents understood the value of education. Unfortunately, mine weren't among them. My father didn't own farmland, but he made a living by buying crops from different farmers and selling them at the market. I had a younger brother, Sam, who was just 10 at the time. I had been ahead in school, making me a high school junior at 14. Even though I didn't fully grasp the importance of education, I knew I wanted more for myself than a life spent in the fields. But my father shattered that dream. 2 days after my 14th birthday, he called me into his room. He told me it was time to quit school because he had arranged for me to work on a friend's large farm. I was skinny, and unlike other kids my age, I didn't have the physical strength needed for farm labor. Maybe it was because my parents barely fed me and my brother properly. I hated the idea of leaving school, but in my family, questioning a parent's decision was unheard of. And just like that, my education was over. On my very first day on the farm, I collapsed from exhaustion. I barely remember what happened when I was revived, but there was chaos. The farm owner personally brought me home, explaining to my parents what had happened, but they weren't concerned about my health. They only wanted to know when I would return to work. My father assured his friend that I would be back the next day after resting. I was devastated by my father's words, but the farm owner's response gave me some relief. He refused to let me work for him anymore, saying I was unfit and didn't want any trouble. My father tried to persuade him, but he had made up his mind. Once the man left, my parents were furious. My little brother, Sam, watched everything in fear, knowing his turn would come in a few years. My father spent days trying to convince other farm owners to hire me, but news about my collapse had spread. No one wanted to take me in. This made my presence at home unbearable for my parents. They seemed irritated by everything I did. They cut down my food portions, yet they still complained I ate too much. If anything went wrong in the house, I was the one to blame. If they could, they would accuse me of taking up too much air. Since no one would hire me, I thought it made sense to return to school. I hesitated for days, but finally gathered the courage to ask my parents one evening. That was a mistake. When I entered their room, their faces twisted in disgust at my presence. I told them I had something important to discuss, and my father impatiently told me to speak quickly. I began explaining how, since I couldn't find work, going back to school would be a better way to spend my time. My mother suddenly stood up and walked past me like she was heading to the bathroom. Then bang, a sharp pain exploded in my head. She had slapped me from behind so hard that I saw stars. I stumbled as she threatened to punish me if I didn't shut up. She lashed out, saying I was too weak to contribute to the family, but somehow had enough strength to go to school. Then she turned to my father, insisting that her suspicion had been right all along. She believed I had faked passing out just to avoid working. At that moment, my father made a decision. He gave me an ultimatum. I had 1 week to go out every day and find a job. If I failed, he would throw me out. I searched desperately, but no one would take me. When the week ended, my father kept his promise. I never saw it coming. One morning, Child Protection Services arrived at our house. My parents told them they could no longer take care of me and wanted me placed in foster care. They abandoned me just like that. When Child Protection Services, CPS, arrived at our home, I was still trying to process the fact that my own parents were willingly giving me up. My father and mother sat across from the agents, trying to justify their decision. They claimed that business was terrible, and they could barely afford to feed my younger brother and me. They told the CPS officers that they could only provide for one child, and since I was useless when it came to physical labor, they had no choice but to let me go. The agents listened carefully, but told my parents that before placing me in an orphanage or foster home, they had to check if there were any living relatives who might be willing to take me in. My father, without hesitation, mentioned that he had only one relative, his cousin, Uncle Ben, who lived in the city. However, my father quickly added that he hadn't seen or spoken to Uncle Ben in years and doubted he could take me in. He claimed that the last time he heard about Uncle Ben, not from him but from someone else, was 7 years ago. Back then, Uncle Ben was struggling financially, and my father assumed nothing had changed. But the reality was different. My father had no idea what kind of life Uncle Ben was living now. The truth is, my father didn't want CPS to reach out to him because he knew there was a possibility that Uncle Ben had built a better life for himself. However, my father also knew that even if my uncle was financially stable, there was no guarantee that he would be willing to help. Years ago, Uncle Ben lived with us when he was trying to finish college. My father never approved of his decision to get an education and constantly mocked him, believing school was just an excuse for laziness. My father was furious that Uncle Ben refused to work on the farms like everyone else. Even after Uncle Ben graduated, he struggled to find a job, and my father grew more and more impatient. Eventually, my father kicked him out, blaming him for wasting time on education instead of choosing farm work. Uncle Ben had no choice but to leave the countryside for the city. Now, I couldn't help but wonder, if you were Uncle Ben, would you take in the child of the cousin who abandoned you years ago? CPS assured me that they would reach out to Uncle Ben and see if he was willing to take me in. I was nervous because I feared his answer would be no, and it'd end up in foster care. I had no choice but to wait. Update 1. A new beginning. I know I promised to keep you updated, and I'm sorry it's taken years to do so. A lot has happened in my life since then. I'm 19 now, and I can finally share what happened after that day. CPS got back to my parents with shocking news. Uncle Ben agreed to take me in. My parents couldn't believe it. They had expected him to hold a grudge and refuse, but instead, he was willing to help me. Rather than feeling guilty for how they treated him, my parents were relieved that they were finally getting rid of me. As we waited for the day I would leave, my parents continued to mock me. They told me that since I had chosen to follow in Uncle Ben's footsteps, I would end up like him, struggling and failing in life. Their words haunted me, and for a while, I started believing them. When the day finally came, CPS arrived to take me to Uncle Ben's home. My parents barely reacted, but my younger brother, Jamie, was devastated. Jamie ran after me, clinging to my arm, crying uncontrollably, and begging me not to go. That moment shattered me. I broke down in tears with him. We held on to each other, knowing that this was goodbye. Our parents quickly separated us, putting on a fake act in front of CPS, pretending they were doing what was best for me. But deep down, I knew what would happen once I left. Jamie would be punished for showing emotion. The drive to my uncle's house felt like the longest journey of my life. My heart pounded as we arrived. When the door opened, Uncle Ben stood there, smiling warmly. He looked genuinely happy to see me after all these years, but I didn't trust it. I believed he was only putting on an act for CPS. I had been treated like a burden my entire life. Why would anyone suddenly care about me now? After a short conversation with Uncle Ben, CPS left. And just like that, my new life began. I braced myself for the worst after CPS left, but to my surprise, it never came. Instead of cold treatment or resentment, Uncle Jeff looked at me with genuine concern. He exclaimed that I was all skin and bones, shaking his head in disbelief. Without hesitation, he showed me to my room and immediately started fixing something for me to eat. The meal he placed in front of me was unlike anything I had ever eaten in my life. The quality, the taste, everything about it was foreign to me. If this was what my parents called failing in life, then I wanted to be a failure. I devoured the food in less than 5 minutes, barely believing my luck. But before I could even ask for more, Uncle Jeff piled another serving onto my plate. I didn't realize how hungry I truly was until I ate like I had never eaten before. After my meal, Uncle Jeff let me rest for the afternoon. That evening, we had a long conversation, one that changed my perspective on everything. I told him the full story, how my parents willingly gave me up, how they made it seem like they had no choice, and how they had used CPS to make it all look legal. Uncle Jeff sighed and shook his head in disappointment. He told me that if my parents had their way, they wouldn't have even gone through CPS. They would have simply thrown me out, but that would have been considered child abandonment, and they could have been arrested. From that moment, I realized just how cruel my parents truly were. Uncle Jeff wasted no time in putting me back in school. He had no children of his own. He had suffered heartbreaks that had taken his focus off marriage. He once told me that he might consider a surrogate in the future, but for now, his focus was on building his wealth. 2 years passed. I had grown healthier, stronger, and more confident. My life had changed completely. But in all that time, my parents never once reached out to see how I was doing. I didn't expect them to, but their lack of concern frustrated Uncle Jeff. He decided he needed to confront them. He asked me to come with him. His car had broken down, so we took a taxi to my parents' home. When we arrived, it was Toby who answered the door. The moment I saw him, my heart ached. He looked nothing like the happy little brother I once knew. While I had transformed, Toby still looked thin, malnourished, and miserable. He was excited to see me. I could tell from the way his eyes lit up, but he didn't express it openly. He was too afraid of our parents. He simply stepped aside, allowing Uncle Jeff and me to enter. Inside, my parents sat in the parlor. My father barely looked at me. My mother, however, was the first to speak. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she asked Uncle Jeff if he was already tired of me. That question cut me like a knife. Was I really nothing more than a burden to them? A problem that people would eventually grow tired of? Before I could even react, Uncle Jeff exploded. He made it clear that he had brought me there to show them how much better I was doing, how their abandonment had proven their failure as parents. But my father simply scoffed. The only thing he saw was that I was sucking up Uncle Jeff's resources. He didn't acknowledge my growth, my health, or my happiness. He simply told Uncle Jeff to take me and leave if we had nothing else to say. Uncle Jeff called them shameless and signaled for me to follow him. I wanted to leave, but my heart felt heavy. The worst part was that Toby remained silent the entire time. I knew it was because our parents had poisoned his mind against me. They had made him see me as a traitor, someone who had abandoned the family, and there was nothing I could do about it. Ash update. Saving Toby. 3 weeks passed after that visit, but I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. Uncle Jeff immediately noticed that something was wrong with me. When he asked, I didn't hesitate to tell him the truth. It was Toby. He had dreams, aspirations, things he wanted to achieve, but as long as he stayed with our parents, none of it would ever happen. They didn't believe in education, and they weren't about to let him pursue any kind of future. And beyond that, I hated that the bond between Toby and me had become so distant. We were once inseparable, but now it felt like we were strangers. Uncle Jeff listened carefully. Then, with a sigh, he said something that made my heart sink. Toby's situation is miserable, but nothing can be done. He lives with your parents. At first, I thought that meant there was no solution, but then it hit me. If the problem was that Toby lived with our parents, then the solution was simple. We had to get him out. I told Uncle Jeff my idea. Since my parents had willingly given me up, surely they would be just as eager to get rid of Toby. Uncle Jeff, however, knew better. Before I could even finish my suggestion, he shook his head. The reason I said it's miserable isn't because I can't take him in, he explained. It's because your parents won't let him go. I refused to accept that answer. I insisted we try. Uncle Jeff, however, was done dealing with my parents. He told me if I wanted to ask them, I could, but he wasn't going with me. So yesterday, I went to visit them alone. As expected, they weren't happy to see me. My mother wasn't home, so it was just my father, Toby, and me. I took a deep breath and told my father why I was there. I wanted Toby to come live with me and Uncle Jeff in the city so that he could go to school. For a moment, my father said nothing. He simply stared at me, completely silent. And then, after 2 long minutes, he finally spoke, and what he said would change everything. My mother picked up the phone after a few rings, and when I told her who it was, she hesitated before responding. I wasted no time and got straight to the point. I told her about Uncle Jeff's condition and how he didn't have much time left. There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped, but then she finally spoke. And why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice completely devoid of emotion. I was stunned. Because he's your brother, I said, trying to contain my frustration. He's dying, Mom. He has maybe weeks left. You and Dad should see him one last time. She scoffed. That man chose his path a long time ago. He turned his back on this family the moment he decided to take you in. Your father won't waste his time on him. Her words stung more than I thought possible. He took me in because you threw me away, I snapped, unable to hold back anymore. And he would have done the same for Toby if you had let him. He was the only real parent I ever had. She sighed, clearly annoyed. If you're done, I have things to do. That was it. That was all she had to say about the man who had been nothing but kind and generous, who had done more for me in a few years than she had my entire life. You're unbelievable, I whispered, shaking my head. Don't bother. I'll make sure Uncle Jeff's last days are filled with love, something you and Dad clearly know nothing about. I ended the call before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I put my phone down. I wanted to scream, to break something, but instead, I took a deep breath and walked back into Uncle Jeff's hospital room. He could tell from the look on my face that the conversation hadn't gone well. I told you not to call them, he said softly, a small, sad smile on his face. I had to try, I admitted, sitting beside his bed. But you were right, they don't care. He reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. It doesn't matter, son. I have you. That was the last meaningful conversation we had. A week later, Uncle Jeff passed away in his sleep. His funeral was small, attended by a handful of people whose lives he had touched. My parents never showed up. Afterward, as I was sorting through his things, I found a letter he had left for me. In it, he told me how proud he was of me and how he knew I would use everything he left behind to make a difference. He also told me not to waste my life dwelling on the past. You have the power to break the cycle, to be better than the people who hurt you. Don't let their actions define you. I took those words to heart. Now at 21, with the resources Uncle Jeff left me, I've started making my dream a reality. I set up a scholarship fund in his name to help kids in our hometown get the education they deserve. As for Toby, he turns 18 in 2 years. I'm doing everything I can to stay in touch with him, to remind him that he has a choice, that he doesn't have to follow the path our parents are forcing on him. And when the time comes, if he wants out, I'll be there. Just like Uncle Jeff was there for me. Life after Uncle Jeff's passing was different, quieter, but not empty. In a way, his presence still lingered in everything he left behind, from the house he built to the dreams he encouraged me to pursue. I honored him every day, not just by living in his home, but by fulfilling the promise I made to help kids like me get an education and a real chance at life. I stayed focused on my plans, but there was still one thing left unfinished. Toby. He turned 18 a few months later, and as soon as his birthday passed, I reached out. We had been keeping in touch, though not as often as I would have liked, since our parents still had a tight grip on him. But now, things were different. He was legally an adult. They couldn't stop him from making his own decisions anymore. Toby, listen, I told him over the phone. You don't have to stay there. You can come live with me. You can go back to school, chase your dreams, whatever you want. You're free now. There was silence on the line for a long moment before he finally spoke. I want to, but I don't know if I can. What do you mean? I asked, heart pounding. They've been telling me for years that you abandoned the family, he admitted. That Uncle Jeff brainwashed you, that you only care about yourself. But I know that's not true. I know they're lying, but it's hard to just walk away. I clenched my jaw. This was exactly what I had feared. Years of manipulation had messed with his head, just like they had tried to do with me. Toby, I said, think about everything you've ever wanted to do but couldn't. Think about all the things they've forced you into. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life living by their rules, doing what they want instead of what makes you happy? More silence. Then, finally, he whispered, no, I don't. Then come home, I urged. Come to me, Toby. That night, he showed up at my doorstep with just a backpack and a look of uncertainty in his eyes. I pulled him into a hug, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my little brother back. You're safe now, I told him, and you're free. Toby enrolled in school the following week. I saw the light return to his eyes as he started taking classes he actually enjoyed, studying things that interested him. He was finally living, not just existing under our parents' control. As for our parents, they tried to reach out, probably because they realized they had lost everything. They had no son to manipulate, no control over anyone anymore. They called, they texted, they even showed up once. But I made it clear, Toby and I had built a life without them, and we weren't going back. This story started with pain, loss, and betrayal, but it ends with hope. Uncle Jeff may be gone, but his legacy lives on, not just in the wealth he left me, but in the way he taught me to stand up for myself and fight for those I love. And that's exactly what I did. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking real-life stories like this. See you in the next one.